The ancient warrior. Once upon a time, there were two wise old warriors discussing their life's experiences in a small village just north of Byzanti. Johann asked Torres to tell his tale once again, so they could bathe in the wisdom. Torres began to speak. "It was a long time ago, my friend," he said. "It was when I was just 19 and a young warrior, and there was unrest between the villages," he explained. "So, it was that our tribe was in battle, when I was cut down in my prime with a spear in the back. The pain was so intense that I fell straight to my knees and collapsed face down in the mud. Then something strange happened." He pulled up his shirt and showed him the scar that was a constant reminder of that day, and that when he spoke the truth. As I lay there on the ground, suddenly the pain began to fade and I found myself disassociated from my physical body, and as I gazed down at it laying there, lifeless, it seemed like a stranger to me, as if it were not I that was laying there mortally wounded face down in the mud. Then, I became aware that I was not the only lost soul that was confused, scared and angry at being cut down in their prime, for there were other discarnate spirits that were in the same disposition as I because of their fatal injuries that they had obtained from the battle. Suddenly, I felt some arms reach down from the sky and lift me up and away from all the carnage that was all around me. After that, a calm, peaceful and comforting feeling came over me, and then I could not feel the pain, confusion and anger no more. I kept rising until I entered a beautiful majestic land, where the buildings and streets were made of gold and were laden with precious gems and stones, and I knew that I had come back from a journey, and that I was now where I truly belonged. He brushed a tear from his eye, but it was not sadness why he wept, it was a tear for the remembrance of pure love and light. In this place, home, you could feel the love and see the light emanating from everything. It was coming from the buildings, the flowers, the grass, the trees, the lakes, the rivers, the mountains, the sky. Yes, the whole kingdom was bathed in love and light, and everything was in such vivid detail and full of grace. He paused to gain his breath. When I arrived there, I was greeted by my ancestors and great warriors alike, and they told me to drink from the river of forgetfulness, and that it would cleanse me and help me to let go of my past incarnation, so as I could be reborn afresh and begin again. Just as I was about to drink, I was told by an angel not to, because I had to go back down to the physical planes as my present self and bring peace and wisdom among the tribes, and that it isn't always was my true destiny. He took another pause. The angel told me that he worked for the highest power of all, and that when he spoke for God, and that it was his destiny to give me this message, and to grant me my resurrection, and that I must take heed and accept my path, and teach the people of earth about the one God and spread its love and wisdom. As I stood before this being of light, I felt like I had no shadow, that I was completely exposed, and I knew that the angel knew everything about me that there was to know, and I felt like a small child in his presence. Next, the whole of my life flashed before my eyes, and I saw all the good and all the bad that I had done up until the crossing, and even though I had lived a virtuous life of which I felt pleased and rewarded, I had not been pure in spirit all the time, and that I had made some questionable choices, was not in doubt, and at the same time I felt like what it was like to be on the receiving end of all my wrongdoings, and I felt ashamed and disappointed by them. Nevertheless, the angel looked upon me with both love and compassion, and told me that my life as of all life in the physical planes, was a life of trial and error, and that sometimes our free will leads us into temptation, which in turn leads us off of the path of righteousness. He said that evil does exist and God is not there to persuade us to be good and to avoid it. That we have come down physically from spirit to find love and compassion through the choices that we make with our free will, and that we will eventually grow, and we will change, and that we all learn from our mistakes. Though, first we must learn to forgive ourselves, like we do unto others, and then let go and move on, and that we will be both the stronger and the wiser for our erroneous experiences and negative ways if we do this. After our acceptance that we are not perfect, we will once again find ourselves back on the path, if not in this life, then the next, or the numerous lives that follow. I asked the angel if I could reincarnate, or maybe stay in heaven, because the times were harsh down there in the physical planes, because of all the selfishness, greed, anger and injustice. He replied that I must resurrect, so that I would still be attached to my present karma, so that I could explain the workings of God, heaven and the earth to the different tribes, and that we are all under God's ever-loving watchful eyes. God wants us to come together and live a life of love, tolerance and compassion, so they must lay down their weapons and unite, as on earth, as in heaven, and learn to tolerate each other and live together as one, and that my message and resurrection would give me credence, clarity and wisdom, and that would bring peace to all. He stopped to take another breath before he carried on with his tale. He repeated his message again to make it clearer to me and to explain my soul's mission. He said if I resurrect, that all the tribesmen will see that I have lived, died and lived again, and that they will believe in me and my ethereal wisdom. He paused and then carried on. He told me to walk away from the light and don't look back. Just keep heading in the opposite direction. It took a lot of effort, but I was able to achieve it. I remember passing through a wasteland that was populated by lost and tormented souls, and after a time I reached a hill, and as I tried to climb it I kept falling back down. Nevertheless, I persisted because I knew that it was important that I reach the summit. After a while and with great effort I succeeded. Then I opened my eyes and I was back in my physical body, and I could feel the pain once more. I was on a pile of dead bodies waiting to be burned, so their souls could be freed from their lives gone by. When to the utter amazement of everyone who was present I awoke. He paused again and then carried on with his tale. I had been 3 days in a deep coma, and I had even been to death's door and back, and had lived to tell the tale, and now I had returned to spread the word of God to all its children. I told them of my strange tale, with the wisdom, and that there was a higher power watching over us all, guiding, nurturing and protecting us, that we should learn to forgive and tolerate each other for our differences, because without differences of opinion there is no room for future development and transformation. Basically, God wanted all the tribes to be at peace and come together as one, and my story spread among the villages and lands like wildfire, and it brought the long sought after peace that we all wanted among the tribes. We became a united world under one God, one religion, and we became the beautiful world that we all live in today. He finished his tale, and his fellow tribesmen thanked him and said, and we all lived happily ever after. Amen. The boy at the lake. Once upon a time, there was an only child that lived and played in a small hamlet in a desolate forest out in the wilderness. One day his imaginary friend helped him to find a beautiful tranquil lake that was surrounded with beautiful fauna and flora. To reach this exotic place there was a strange, pleasant and mysterious path that twisted and twined through the dense forest toward the lake. Later, When the boy got home, he wrote in his journal his account of how he and his imaginary friend and guide had traveled on their sacred journey, and when he was in bed reading his journal that night with his nightlight, he eventually drifted off to sleep. While he slept, he dreamt that he was crumbling sweet cake into fluffy crumbs and then casting it into the ambient lake. Now, as the boy watched the light shimmer and flitter as the cake crumbs made outward-bound ripples on the surface of the water, he could see in the distance the beautiful birds flock to the food source and gloriously consume the cake. As they fed, the child could see all the splendid colors of the birds' feathers, and he sat down on the bank and admired their natural beauty. Then, suddenly his dark curiosity persuaded him to cast a stone into the lake. The boy was aghast at the chaos as the pebble plummeted into the lake. The birds flapped, fluttered and panicked as they made their hasty retreat from where the sad boy now sat. The next day the boy wrote of his dream in his diary, and after some reflection he swore an oath and then wrote it down, so that he would never forget that he would always cast sweet cake crumbs and not stones into the lake. Albatross. He soared to untold heights, above and beyond into the summer sky, oscillating from thermal to thermal that rose from the ambient ocean beneath. Not a thought in his mind, as he encapsulated all the beauty that was within the scope of the horizon. Pure love permeated his very essence, as the sun spread its warmth across his whole being as it cascaded down from the heavens above. The light around him descended and then came to rest, as it lay majestically coruscating upon the undulating water's surface, and it was then that he was in total peace, joy and bliss, and in absolute union with all that was creation. The Ascent. Once upon a time, there was a young boy called Andrew, and he lived in a small village at the foot of a vast mountain. As far back as he could remember, he was in awe of its immensity and the mysteries that it must hold. So one day in his middle teens he decided to climb it to satisfy his desire. Whilst out playing with his friends at its foot, he told them of his would-be adventure, and then he began to ascend to its heights. At first his friends all stood at its base and jeered at what they thought was pretense and stupidity. However, as he persisted, some gave him encouragement, and others began to shout their concern of the possible danger. Even though the ambivalent voice of the crowd echoed his own inner feelings, still he climbed. After a while he turned around and he looked down. He was as high as a house, and as he took in this new view, he saw some of his friends running to the village to seek help. Then he began to climb once more. His friends returned with his parents, and they began to shout up in anger, and their threats seemed impotent, for they were so small. As he looked down at them, he could see that his father's face was full of concern, and his mother's was awash with tears and fear of losing her only son. He felt their pain and frustration, and he considered making his way back down, but he could hear a beckoning voice deep within coaxing him to resume his ascent. So he turned around and made his way up once more. Soon the elders from his village arrived, and they all began to shout and warn him of the danger he had put himself in, accompanied by the grief that he was giving his family and friends, but still he climbed. After a time, all he could hear were distorted echoes ricocheting off the rocks and the face of the mountain, and when he looked down, the villagers were out of sight. As he scanned his new scope, he could see not only his own village, but also other villages that he had never seen before in person. He had only heard of them in talk, or from the nomads that journeyed from village to village in search of trade. He turned about and began to mount once more. As he scaled, he began to fear the consequences of his choices and actions as he slipped from time to time. All the rocks that he was holding on to give way to his weight, and went tumbling a little way down the mountain, leaving him in absolute shock and relief as they showed what could have happened to him, but still he persisted. Then came the rain, and he feared that he may slip, or be washed to his death. So he stayed still for a while and pondered on what to do. He thought to himself that he must either go up or down, for there was no sense or safety in his staying put. He finally decided that if he went up it was easier, because he could see where to grasp and where to place his footing. After a time, he had climbed high above the rain clouds, and the mountain surface became ice-laden. To his dismay, the ice did not feel cold at all, but had a mysterious warmth and glow to it. So up he climbed. The small voice that had been inside of him giving him encouragement all the way had become louder the higher that he got, and he realized that the voice had been there from as far back into his childhood as he could remember, and it was the voice that had urged him to his destiny in the first place. Then, he finally saw the summit, and he made his way to the top. And when he was there, he looked down at the spectacular view that was all about him, and it was then that he realized that that inner voice was his own true voice, as it told him that there was never any reason to fear, for he could fly. At that, Andrew leaped off of the mountain's peak and ascended into untold heights, where he discovered a beautiful, peaceful land full of like-minded beings that welcomed him home to a magnificent city, where he was to live happily ever after. The Gold of Fools. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful village that was next to the sea. The villagers were always content, because the local farms, forests and the ocean supplied them with their every need. Then one day a nomadic magician came to the village, and he cast a spell that made the tide go out, and then he transformed all the pebbles on the beach into gold. Seeing this, the villagers stopped what they were doing and made their way to the shore to collect their bounty, and they filled their pockets with as much as they could muster, took it home and stored it. Then they returned again and again for more and more. When the night came and all the villagers were in their beds and dreaming of all their gold and what fortunes that it will bring in the morrow, the tide came back in, because there was not a beach to stop the tide engulfing the village. The people of the village were drowned in their sleep. Art for art's sake. There was once an omnipotent king from an almighty empire that had the most bountiful, unique and precious treasure, an art collection of all the known lands. One day the king heard of a notorious wise man that was venturing through his kingdom, so he sent a messenger to invite him to a banquet, and then to a tour of his legendary collection, so as he could add the experience to his wisdom. The sage gladly accepted the king's generous invitation, not only because it was the appropriate thing to do, and that he would love to meet him and share some wisdom, but also because he had heard of the king's awesome collection, and it would not be wise to not add this to his living experiences. The king and the sage feasted on the banquet that was set before them, and it was a banquet that was fit for kings of kings. While they gorged, they witnessed the most admirable performers entertain them, and then after they had filled their stomachs, heads and hearts with the delightful sensory experience, the king led the sage around his magnificent collection. There were precious jewels, metals and archaeological artifacts, along with sculptures, drawings and paintings for them to admire. The wise man's senses were saturated as he was guided from room to room, from corridor to corridor, by his most respected, admirable and royal host. At the end of the tour, they sat in another dining hall where they chose and then consumed some fine wine with exotic beverages. The tour had lasted many hours, and so they were both exhausted and famished from the awesome experience. They were in need of rest and replenishment before they bid each other farewell, and the sage went on his way. As they sat there nibbling at the luxurious food and drinking from the extensive wine collection that was set before them, they were enjoying some light musical entertainment, as the sage shared some of his wisdom with the king. As he finished his tales, he told the king that that was his gift, as he thanked him for all his treasures that he had so generously given him on this most unforgettable and spectacular day. The king became awash with terror at the sage's last comment, and he pointed out that he had only been guided and shown his collection, and that they had not given it to him. The sage then gave off both a pleasant and knowing smile, and then he replied by stating that he had not misunderstood the king's actions or intent on this most wonderful and amazing day, and that he did not think that the collection was his to carry away per se, for it is only that when one bears witness to such astonishing beauty, that although one can never hold on to it in its form or substance, that one will ever hold on to its essence in one's eternally blissful heart. The heat. There was once a young man that walked through the desert when the sun was high into the sky above him, and after 8 continuous hours in the burning sun he eventually fell down and died. When the angel of death came down to collect him, he asked, "Why did you walk through the desert when you knew that it would kill you?" And he replied, "I know, but I really love the heat." The frogs at the pool story. Once upon a time, there was the land of frogs, and they all played happily and merrily at the pool. Then one day a frog tasted the water, spat it out and said, "This water, it does not taste as sweet as it did yesterday," and a few frogs listened and then they didn't. Then, the next generation of frogs came along and they all played happily and merrily at the pool. Then one day a frog tasted the water, spat it out and said, "This water, it does not taste as sweet as it did yesterday," and a few frogs listened and then they didn't. Then the next generation came along and there was a pool of dead frogs.